Good day. Today, 18th September, we get further indications of tensions and conflicts within the West and divisions about what to do with a war in Ukraine that everybody knows Ukraine is losing, that the West is losing as well, because to an extent that perhaps even Western leaders never fully anticipated, it has clearly become, the Ukraine war has clearly become a proxy war between themselves and Russia, and a proxy war which they are, of course, losing. Anyway, even as everybody knows that this war is being lost, we see tensions between those who advocate escalation and those who are trying to find what they would describe, I think, as an off-ramp. Now, as to the fact that the war is being lost, there's been a fascinating article that has just come out recently in the Washington Post by, of all people, David Ignatius. David Ignatius is a very influential US journalist. He's clearly extremely well connected. He's got friends. I don't think this is controversial in the State Department, in the intelligence community. He's one of those journalists that people like Tony Blinken like to be interviewed by. He's one of the people that they go to for when they want to be interviewed. Anyway, David Ignatius has recently, from what I can understand, been in contact with Ukrainian soldiers who've been wounded. This all seems to be connected with some kind of operation, funding operation, and for recovery centres and hospitals for wounded Ukrainian soldiers, organised by a man who David Ignatius refers to as the Ukrainian businessman, Viktor Pinchuk. Many people would use the word oligarch, Ukrainian oligarch, to describe Pinchuk. That's perhaps the preferred word that I would use. Certainly, he has been one of the most important and influential figures in Ukrainian politics for a very long time. And for the record, he's also been a significant donor to political causes in the United States, which I'm not going to talk about in this program. Anyway, David Ignatius has been and has met some of these Ukrainian soldiers, some of them who have been severely wounded. He's listened to what a lot of them have to say, and he's clearly shaken, profoundly shaken, by what they have told him. And the key paragraph in this article, which I should say its title is Ukraine is bleeding out. It cannot fight forever. Supporting Ukraine as long as it takes does not match the reality of this conflict. Anyway, the key paragraph is this one. Listening to their stories, that's to say to the stories of these Ukrainian soldiers, you realize that Ukraine is bleeding out. Its will to fight is as strong as ever. That, by the way, is very debatable, but I'm not going to argue with David Ignatius at this point. Its will to fight is as strong as ever, but its army is exhausted by a ceaseless drone war that's unlike anything in the history of combat. By the way, a disclosure from David Ignatius that the war in Ukraine has developed in a technological way completely unexpected for the United States. But anyway, let's not dwell on that either. And then David Ignatius goes on to say this: the Biden administration's rubric of support, as long as it takes, simply doesn't match the reality of this conflict. Ukraine doesn't have enough soldiers to fight an indefinite war of attrition. Now, I've been discussing, Brian Beletic has been discussing, Viktor Vashinin has been discussing, all sorts of people have been talking about the fact that the war that the Russians have been fighting against the Ukrainians has been a war of attrition. General Surovikin, who was briefly the overall commander of the Russian forces fighting in the zone of the special military operation, gave an interview in October 2022 in which he described the Russian strategy. It was not to go for big arrow offensives. It was to build up reserves, create strong defense lines, and grind the Ukrainians down. And that's what the Russians have been doing. And as I've discussed in many programs, after October 2023, when Ukraine's offensive in Zaporozhye and Kherson region failed, and failed completely and disastrously, the Russians transitioned from defensive attrition, which is the attrition that Surovikin was describing in October 2022, towards a policy of aggressive attrition, one in which they obviously take territory, they take fortified positions, but one in which they continue to prioritize attrition, grinding the Ukrainians down. Anyway, David Ignatius now admits that, and he admits that this is taking a terrible toll on Ukraine. They're talking witlessly about supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes. In his words, does not match the reality of this conflict. And then he goes on to say, Ukraine doesn't have enough soldiers to fight an indefinite war of attrition. It is, in other words, being ground down, just as Surovikin said, just as the Russians have been saying and have been doing, well, all along. But David Ignatius doesn't want to discuss peace. He's not interested in negotiations. He is not looking for any sort of off-ramp, because his next sentence after those words, Ukraine doesn't have enough soldiers to fight an indefinite war of attrition, his next sentence is, Ukraine needs to escalate to be strong enough to reach a decent settlement. And he ends his article with these words, in which he goes on to describe what he thinks the purpose, the goal of the United States would be. I came away from the conference thinking the United States should take more risks to help Ukraine. It matters how this war ends. If Putin prevails, it will harm the interests of America and Europe for decades. Notice he talks about America and Europe, what it's going to do to Ukraine. Well, I'm not saying it doesn't bother him. Clearly, if you read his article, he's deeply shaken by the stories that he has heard. But he seems to understand that in order to have influence in Washington, he needs to talk about American and European interests. And he ends the very last sentence of his article is, it's not sentimentality that underlies deeper American support for Ukraine, but US national interest. So, according to David Ignatius, the right way forward is through escalation. Ukraine is clearly losing. It is being ground down. It is being ground down by a war of attrition that is unlike any war that the United States, that David Ignatius, has ever encountered before. It is bleeding to death. That's, again, what David Ignatius says. Ukraine is bleeding out. It cannot fight forever. Those are the words, the title of his article. But the solution is not to seek an off-ramp, it is to escalate, to do what the British want, which is to launch missile strikes deep inside Russia. And if you read the article carefully, that's precisely what he advocates. He talks not just about storm shadows, but ATACMS and all of the rest, all of the points that have been made by people like Lloyd Austin and by many others, by the way, that the Russian targets are beyond the reach of these missiles, that the attacks with these missile strikes would be incredibly provocative, but would achieve little militarily, that they wouldn't change the direction of the war. Well, David Ignatius simply doesn't seem to see this or hear any of this. He can't accept an off-ramp. He can't accept what he would construe as a defeat. For him, anything that is not an outright Ukrainian and therefore American victory is a defeat. So he wants escalation. He wants deep missile strikes. He disregards Russian warnings. He's unconcerned about Putin's talk about missile strikes being an act of war. He wants them to happen because that's the way he hopes and feels that the situation can be turned around. And I will say this, if it fails, if what he advocates takes place and the missile strikes happen, and well, let's assume that the Russians don't respond in the way that I expect they will. And Ian Proud, British diplomat who knows the Russians far better than I do, and who discussed this very topic with us on the Duran, Alex Christoforou and myself, in a live stream we did with him yesterday. Ian Proud, of course, having been posted to the embassy, the British embassy in Moscow, having had several contacts, many contacts with Russian officials, having listened to Putin many times, having read and keeping abreast of what the Russian media say. Well, let's assume that we are all wrong, and we might be. I mean, if I'm not always right about everything, let's assume that the Russians don't respond against this extreme provocation in the way that we expect. Let's assume that they continue to grind the Ukrainians down, that the missile strikes take place, but don't change the direction of the conflict. They cannot do so. That is the unanimous consensus, as far as I can see, of the military experts, the actual military experts. Well, let's ask ourselves then, what will David Ignatius say? Well, if you follow his logic, he will demand some further form of escalation. I cannot see any other route that he can follow, given that he will not accept an Ukrainian and by extension an American defeat. He will simply want more escalation still. He wants even more advanced weapons to be sent to Ukraine. In fact, I doubt that there's any weapon, short presumably of nuclear weapons, that he would not want to be seen sent to Ukraine. By the way, I recall that back in 2022, somebody did advocate supplying Ukraine with nuclear weapons, but I can't believe that even someone like David Ignatius, who clearly wants and is desperate for a Ukrainian victory, would be prepared to go that far. Just saying. But anyway, he wants everything else that can be found to be sent. And by the way, on that topic, and coming back to what Brian Beletic has been saying, I read a report today that there's still $6 billion of money left, which could be used to provide weapons to Ukraine. But the Pentagon is saying that the arsenals are now completely depleted. There's not apparently enough weapons that these $6 billion can buy to be sent to Ukraine. That was an article that I think it was in CNN that actually said that. So we know we've run out of weapons that we can send to Ukraine. That's certainly true of the Europeans, has been true of the Europeans for some time. It is now, well, perhaps not entirely true, but largely true of the Americans as well. But anyway, David Ignatius would want to continue to escalate. Whatever weapons can still be sent, he would want to send them. And if you follow the logic of his argument, eventually he would want American troops, of this I have absolutely no doubt, to be sent to Ukraine as well, to fight the Russians directly. Because I cannot see, given that he rejects completely the idea of a negotiated solution or an off-ramp that is anything short of a Ukrainian-American victory. Well, that has to be the end point to which he is prepared to go. Maybe he doesn't accept that at the present time, but in 6 months, in a year's time, when the missile strikes have failed and the Russians have continued to advance, and when Slavyansk and Kramatorsk have fallen, and perhaps Kharkiv as well, and when the Russians are on the brink of crossing the Dnieper, presumably that is what he will start to agitate and demand and call for. Just saying. I'm not saying it will happen, by the way, but anyway, that's one line of thinking. Escalation. That's the way to deal with the fact that we are losing the war in Ukraine. And Ignatius clearly can see the fact that the war in Ukraine is being lost. But of course there is the alternative view. And the alternative view has now been set out in articles in the Wall Street Journal, an article which appeared a week ago, and another article which appeared in Bloomberg. The article in Bloomberg appeared yesterday. And the article in the Wall Street Journal says that Zelensky, it's always Zelensky, needs to think of a plan B. And we read in the article, the West still backs Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's long-term stated aim of taking back control of its territory. But some European diplomats say Ukraine needs to be more pragmatic in its wartime aims and strategy. That could help Western officials advocate to their respective voters the need to funnel arms and aid to the country. And quite how that's going to help the situation. Anyway, that's what the Wall Street Journal said, that there's pressure in Europe especially for Zelensky to start accepting, well, he can't get it all back now. He can't get all of the territory back. He's got to accept that there's got to be some territorial concessions, even though these will not be territorial concessions that amount to an actual acceptance of Russian sovereignty over the territories in eastern Ukraine that Ukraine would have to give up. It would be a temporary thing. It would be like West Germany and East Germany. You go through the motions of pretending that you recognize East Germany, but your aspiration remains the same as always to reassimilate this entire territory back into Ukraine. And that will be the position that you take. And Bloomberg goes a bit further. And it says, as part of their discussions of strategy for the next year, Western officials are more seriously gaming out how a negotiated end to the conflict and an off-ramp could take shape. Notice the word off-ramp. It's not really, we're not looking for a long-term, sustainable, permanent peace. All we're worried about is getting ourselves an off-ramp. And we're told that the hawks, people presumably like David Ignatius, are concerned that this could lead to a premature ceasefire. That's going back to David Ignatius. We have to go on fighting, we have to go on escalating, because the only kind of negotiations that we can have are ones which ultimately result in us dictating terms to the Russians. But let's put aside what the hawks, people like David Ignatius, and, dare I say it, my own Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, what they want, what Boris Johnson and Ben Wallace and all of those people want. Let's talk instead about what the more moderate people apparently want. And we go back to Bloomberg. The people, these diplomats who want some kind of off-ramp, made clear that any decision to negotiate would be for Kiev to make, and that nobody is pressuring Zelensky into talks, which, by the way, if true, means that there won't be any talks, but you should take that with a gigantic cascade of salt. Almost certainly pressure is being applied on Zelensky to try to get him to talk, because these diplomats must know that if it was left to him, he would never talk at all. Not ever, not under any circumstances at all. So undoubtedly there is pressure. How strong it is another matter. And of course there's the countervailing pressure from people like Starmer and Lamy and Blinken and all of the others. The hawks, in other words, to keep fighting, to escalate, because we have to avoid, as they say, what they like to call a premature ceasefire. And then Bloomberg goes on to say, Ukraine's president has been adamant, publicly and privately, that ceding territory to Russia would be unfair. He's used a lot stronger words than that. With no sign that Russia has scaled back its objectives, the prospect of real negotiations still remains distant. But as the war heads towards another winter, there's little sign of breakthrough on the battlefield. That's prompting some Allied officials to start exploring ways in which diplomacy can break the deadlock. I have to say that whole sentence, that whole paragraph, takes my breath away. As the war heads towards another winter, there's little sign of breakthrough on the battlefield. How many signs of breakthrough do you need? Toretsk, perhaps weeks away from falling. Ukrainsk, as we will see shortly, captured by the Russians yesterday. Selidovo, perhaps a quarter of it now, occupied by the Russians. Vuhledar about to fall. The entire South Donbass area, the defense positions of the Ukrainians there, soon to collapse. And as we will see, real prospects of Chasiv Yar also falling, and a looming collapse or catastrophe for the Ukrainians in Kursk. And of course, Ukraine, without any of its thermal power plants, down to, as I read somewhere, something like 15% of its electricity generation, unable to import energy, looking for rolling blackouts throughout the winter. Half its population gone, emigrated mostly, according to Ukrainian officials. Industrial output in a state of collapse. You say that there is little sign of a breakthrough on the battlefield. If these people in these capitals really think that, and they really think they've got a lot of time to work with, then I think that they're every bit as delusional, and I have to say this, as the hardliners, people like Starmer, Wallace, Blinken, Ignatius, and all of the others that we've been talking about. It bears no relation to the actual reality of the situation in the war. But anyway, they're now far too late in the day, starting to think about what they call an off-ramp. What is an off-ramp? It's not peace. doesn't seem as if they're prepared to deal with Putin or address his concerns, the concerns that led him to launch the special military operation. They don't seem to be willing to cede on the question of NATO membership or any of those things. They're somehow just looking for some kind of off-ramp. A ceasefire, and it would only be a ceasefire, a temporary freezing of the conflict, which would get them out of trouble, presumably enable them to bundle Ukraine into NATO. In other words, a set of proposals which the Russians are bound to refuse. Takes me back to those eternally true words of E. Smith, written a while back, that the West spends all its time, when it decides that it needs to negotiate, it spends all its time discussing and negotiating the terms upon which it is prepared to settle with itself, disregarding completely what the other side thinks, so that when it comes up with a consensus on what it is prepared to concede, it comes back shocked to find that the other side is not interested. In this instance, if all that the West is prepared to concede is some kind of off-ramp, a ceasefire along the current front lines, something of that nature, then obviously, so far as the Russians are concerned, that doesn't remotely address their core interests, which they've defined repeatedly as their own security, which means a complete agreement, a cast-iron agreement on Ukraine's neutrality and its position outside NATO, at the very least, together with its demilitarization. And unless the West is prepared to acknowledge that and to accept that, then there is no prospect of the Russians agreeing to any kind of settlement on those lines. They've never shown any interest in a settlement on those lines in the past, and they are certainly not going to do so now when they are winning the war. Now, that brings me, of course, to the next point, which is again about Ukraine's NATO membership, which remains the core, fundamental, overriding issue, the one around which this whole crisis has been organized, the one that, in effect, set the fuse for the conflict when NATO basically told Ukraine that it was welcome to apply for NATO membership at the disastrous Bucharest NATO summit meeting in 2008. Well, the point to say here is that the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, continues his unending narrative that there is some kind of massive plot against the West that the West has to oppose, and that the Russians are now becoming part of some great sinister alliance with the Chinese and the North Koreans and the Iranians. And that is, of course, a tremendous threat to the West in particular, and to the Western way of life, and to world peace in general. And he's just given a very interesting, and in fact, in my opinion, very disturbing interview to this effect. I'm taking all of this from the London Times. Moscow, beholden to Beijing in anti-Western axis, says NATO chief. Jens Stoltenberg, the outgoing head of the military alliance, says Putin will pay a price for dependence on enabler C. And then we go on to read, this is all from the London Times. President Putin is unifying an authoritarian axis of China, Iran and North Korea around his war in Ukraine, leaving Moscow increasingly beholden to Beijing, NATO's chief has told The Times. Russia is mortgaging its future to Beijing and is, of course, not getting this for free, explained Jens Stoltenberg, the alliance's Secretary General, who leaves office after a decade in October. In an interview with The Times, he warned that since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Beijing, Moscow, Tehran and Kim Jong-un's hermit regime in North Korea were becoming more and more aligned. At the head of the alliance is President Xi, with China the decisive enabler of Putin, said Stoltenberg. The former Norwegian Prime Minister added that support to Russia from the four powers continues to accelerate. We see how authoritarian powers are aligning more and more. We see that clearly demonstrated in the war, in Russia's war against Ukraine, where they all provide significant mutual support. And then we go on to read, this is all from The Times, in a briefing in July, General Sir Rowley Walker, Chief of the General Staff in the British Army, warned that Britain and its allies had 3 years to prepare for war against an axis of upheaval. That's the new phrase, apparently, not the axis of evil, but the axis of upheaval. Western officials fear that by giving key weapons components to Putin, who is isolated by Western sanctions. Why continue to say isolated by Western sanctions when this very same article tells us that Russia is now part of a sinister alliance with China, the world's biggest economy, by purchasing power parity standards, Iran, North Korea, and all of the rest. But anyway, never mind. Western officials fear that by giving key weapons components to Putin, who is isolated by Western sanctions, Beijing has gained the technology it needs for military dominance. Stoltenberg confirmed that Moscow was giving China know-how after officials in Washington said Russia was providing advanced submarine, missile and stealth capabilities to Beijing. China is a decisive enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine. China is upholding Russia's war economy, and China is delivering the components, the microelectronics, the microprocessors that Russia is using to build the missiles and the bombs they are using in Ukraine, Stoltenberg said. But go back to that other point, one which apparently Stoltenberg confirms, and which we're told that Western officials now fear that by giving key weapons components to Putin, who is isolated by Western sanctions, Beijing has gained the technology it needs for military dominance. Now, do you notice anything immediately obvious about this whole article, this whole narrative that we're being spun by people like Stoltenberg? Well, if we go back to that article that I discussed in my programme yesterday, the one by Conor Gallagher, the one in which he discussed how the Europeans are wringing their hands about Europe's economic decline, how they're engaging in ever more far-fetched plans and schemes and ideas about how to reverse that decline without addressing the elephant in the room, which is the fact that they've cut themselves off from their previously secure, stable and cheap energy supply from Russia. Well, just as Conor Gallagher said that the Europeans, Mario Draghi specifically, who's just written a report on the subject, simply will not acknowledge their own role in bringing about this very economic disaster that they are now trying to address, their own role, by intentionally cutting themselves off from Russian gas and oil and other energy. Well, so Stoltenberg complains vociferously about this Russian-Chinese alliance that he's talking about. He frets and worries that the Chinese are giving the Russians chips, because that's what it amounts to, which are enabling the Russians to go on churning out weapons, and that in return the Russians are giving the Chinese all kinds of access to technologies for making submarines, missiles, who knows what else. And we're told that Western officials fear that by giving key weapons components to Putin, who is isolated by Western sanctions, Beijing has gained the technology it needs for military dominance. And by the way, there's been a very similar article, identical article, in the United States as well, though I can't remember where it was. But anyway, all of this has happened apparently without the West, without people like Stoltenberg having any part to play in it at all. The fact that the Russians might be giving all this technology to the Chinese, which is enabling China to achieve military dominance. I think that is alarmist and absurd, by the way, but that's what they say. All of this has nothing to do with them. They insisted, the same Jens Stoltenberg insisted, he insisted before the war began, he was incredibly loud and insistent about this, as I remember, during the diplomatic negotiations which preceded the war in 2021, that NATO membership for Ukraine was not up for discussion, that the Russians would just have to lump it, that NATO wanted it, that the government in Ukraine wanted it, that the Russians had no right to any say or opinion on the matter, despite the fact that it meant the expansion of what the Russians see as a hostile military alliance right up to their borders, incorporating territory which for 300 years was part of their own country. Well, that was Stoltenberg. He was insistent about that in 2021. He's been insistent about that ever since, that the Russians have no right to question NATO expansion. And now, when there's a war, he complains that the Russians have turned to the Chinese and in return for Chinese chips are busy giving the Chinese the technology that the Chinese supposedly need to achieve military dominance. It is exactly the same as what we have seen from Mario Draghi. Western officials who have led the West to disaster wash their hands of the whole affair. It's nothing to do with them. They're not in any way responsible or accountable. Stoltenberg still doesn't want to discuss any conceivable limit on NATO expansion. When J.D. Vance floated the idea a few days ago, all sorts of horrified expressions floated up. It's as if Stoltenberg doesn't himself know that the Russians were concerned about NATO expansion, and this led to the war. This is what has led to the war in Ukraine. Glenn Deason, who has written an utterly brilliant article about the origins of the war, about the way in which supposedly Western support, Western help for Ukraine, that it is actually leading to the destruction of Ukraine. In this article, which appears on his Substack blog, Glenn Deason goes methodically and systematically through agreement after agreement reached by the Russians with the Western powers, Minsk I, Minsk II, all of the others, trying to find some means to settle the conflict diplomatically, and how Ukraine, and in particular the West, weren't keen on any of these proposals, worked night and day to undermine all of them. Anyway, in that article, you will find quoted again those words of Jens Stoltenberg himself, made just a few months ago, in which Jens Stoltenberg straightforwardly accepted that the reason that the Russians intervened in Ukraine is because they were worried about NATO's expansion into Ukraine. So that's why there is the war. That's why after the sanctions, which Stoltenberg has supported, after the Western arms deliveries, which Stoltenberg supports, by the way, he is also outspokenly demanding missile strikes against Russia. He wants all prohibitions or restrictions or limitations on that to be cast aside. Anyway, he demands all of those things. He says that the Russians have no right, still no right, to question NATO expansion. And now he's complaining when all of these positions which he has taken have led us directly to this point, he's now complaining that the Russians are providing the Chinese with military technology which could enable the Chinese to achieve military dominance. It's astonishing to me that at this stage in the conflict, none of this is discussed properly, openly, as it should be. You find the odd article in places like Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, the National Interest. But for every article like that you will find in all of these journals, you will find 10 others that continue to insist that Ukraine must be supported to the nth level, that will follow the David Ignatius line, in other words. And of course, from Western political leaders, from Stoltenberg, it's now either further escalation, which is what Stoltenberg demands, he's not prepared to reconsider or concede or revisit or rethink anything any more than David Ignatius, for example, is. Well, it's either that, go forward with unlimited escalation, again, ignore what the Russians say, or instead look for an off-ramp, try and get the Russians to agree to some kind of ceasefire whilst conceding them nothing of substance, ignoring the realities of the war. Well, all I can say is it's dreadful. It is going to lead us nowhere. As Glenn Deason correctly pointed out in that Substack article, it is taking us step by step along that primrose path that John Mearsheimer, Professor Mearsheimer, discussed all the way back in 2015. It's taking us step by step towards Ukraine's final destruction. But there it is. That's where we are. Now, for the Russian point of view, they watch, they listen, they hear all of this, they continue the war. And as for the Ukrainians, well, Bloomberg says that the Ukrainians still resisting all the pressure that's been put upon them. Not, of course, that there is any pressure. Bloomberg reassures us that there is actually no pressure. But anyway, that they're still resisting all the pressure. There've just been a whole series of interviews and with aides, close aides of Zelensky's, and they're still talking about regaining all their lost territories, even as they lose the war. They're not prepared to shift and change position by a single millimeter, even though, again, as Glenn Deason has pointed out in that very same Substack article, in March 2022, no less a person than President Zelensky said that Ukraine, the Western powers, wanted to lead Ukraine into a long war against Russia in order, as they hoped, to weaken Russia, which of course it is not doing, even if the price for that was the destruction of Ukraine, and that obviously was not something that he as president of Ukraine could agree to, which is why in March 2022 he was actually briefly seeking peace. He said that in March 2022, but now, as a result of all that's happened, as a result of all the threats he continues to receive, as a result, I suspect, of a dramatic change in his own personality, very volatile personality that the war itself has brought about, he has now become as hardline as everyone else. And as I've pointed out in earlier programs, he undoubtedly knows that if the war ends, his political career is over, and perhaps not just his political career, but his own safety might be over as well. Anyway, I don't want to explore and discuss all of that. We are in a trap. We are in a trap in Ukraine. Simon Jenkins said that yesterday in an article in The Guardian, which I discussed in my previous video. And these articles from Bloomberg, from the Wall Street Journal, from David Ignatius they all show that we have no way out of this trap. We've trapped ourselves inside, and all we can do is rattle around inside it, floating plans and ideas with each other that are either incredibly irresponsible and dangerous, like missile strikes against Ukraine, or which have no prospect of being accepted, which are, of course, the so-called off-ramps that some people are talking about. Anyway, let me say again, what all of these discussions tell us is the essential thing, which is that Western governments now understand that the war is being lost. I think it has taken them a little longer to see this than it has taken Ukraine itself. I think the Ukrainian leadership came to understand around June or July that Ukraine is going to lose the war. I think its actions since then reflect that fact. I think for the West, that realization has come now. There's more than a hint of panic about all of this, because no one can see a clear way out, no one in power at the moment. Of course, a new administration in Washington might perhaps find the courage and the strength to take a different course, but none of the leaders that are there today show any capacity to do that. And in desperation, they're coming up with alternatively fantastic or dangerous ideas, which in the end can lead nowhere. Now, talking about dangerous ideas, we've now had a very interesting article in Politico about the Kursk operation. And the title of this article is Zelensky was urged not to invade Kursk. He did it anyway. Some of Ukraine's top commanders questioned the cross-border assault into Russia, Ukrainian military officials tell Politico. And we learn, we have to go quite far into the article to get to the substance of this. We get instead all kinds of stories from Ukrainian soldiers who've been crippled as a result of the fighting in Kursk, about how they still think it was a good idea. But eventually we get to the admission that some of Ukraine's top army commanders, including the former Armed Forces Commander General Valery Zaluzhny, now Ukraine's ambassador to London, when Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky first broached the offensive earlier this year and pushed for it, argued against it. Others who opposed the offensive included the highly respected Emil Ishkulov, commander of Ukraine's 80th Air Assault Brigade. He was dismissed in July amid protests from high-ranking officers who called for him to be kept in post. And we learn that the reason Ishkulov was dismissed was that he opposed a task that didn't correspond to the brigade's strength. According to two high-ranking Ukrainian military officers who were granted anonymity to speak with Politico, Ishkulov objected to the Kursk operation, fearing his brigade could eventually be exposed inside Russia and that the casualty toll could rise precipitously. Zaluzhny's objection to the incursion, meanwhile, was that there was no clear second step after the border had been successfully breached by elite Ukrainian units drawn from 4 brigades, according to these officials. Zaluzhny queried, "Once you have the bridgehead, what then?" He never got a clear answer from Zelensky, said one of the officials. He felt it was a gamble, he said. And we're then told that neither Zaluzhny nor Ishkulov would answer questions from Politico, and that Zaluzhny's concerns reflect concerns by both Western and Ukrainian doubters, worrying that Kiev's forces could get caught inside and suffer a demoralizing reversal. And we'll come to all of that in a moment. Now, the interesting question then that arises from this article is that if Zaluzhny did indeed oppose this operation, when exactly did he do so? He was, of course, dismissed by Zelensky many months ago. The article sort of implies, but doesn't quite say, that he was dismissed in February, in fact, because he opposed the Kursk operation. So that would suggest that Zelensky was already thinking of the operation in Kursk way back in February. Now, we're told that Zaluzhny was going around asking, what is the point of this? We're going to get our troops into Kursk. What are they supposed to do there? We're going to occupy villages, a few forests and rivers and places of that kind. It's all far away from the front line where the war is being decided. What are we supposed to be doing there? And of course, we run terrible risks in casualties if we do that. Now, I think that this is all very disingenuous. I have said already, and it is my belief, and the Russians have said that it is their belief too. In fact, the Russians have gone further. They're saying that it is their actual knowledge that the objective of the Kursk operation was, in fact, to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant. Could it be, just saying, that Zelensky was already floating this harebrained idea as long ago as last February? Maybe. And could it be that Zaluzhny said, this isn't going to work, we're never going to get to the Kursk nuclear power plant. If we don't succeed in getting to the Kursk nuclear power plant, it will become a disaster for us, and that is why Zelensky sacked him? That's just a question. Or could it be that Zaluzhny, who clearly doesn't like Zelensky very much, is making this all up now and is getting these Ukrainian officers to spin a story to Politico? Or could it be that Zaluzhny was in the loop and that he did find out about this operation soon before it was launched, and the fact that Ishkulov was sacked in July is suggestive. It suggests that it was in July that the plans for the Kursk operation were finally hatched or finally formulated. And that's the month, by the way, when I think that the Ukrainians began to understand that the war was lost. So this would fit with that thinking and would make it look even more like the desperate gamble, which I and people like Gordon Hahn think it was. Well, could it be that Zaluzhny, who presumably still has his contacts within the Ukrainian military was tipped off about it in July and weighed in and told Zelensky, this is crazy, it isn't going to work, what are you doing, what is the thinking behind all of this? And Zelensky never got back to him, because by that point, Zaluzhny had been completely cut out of the loop. Well, I find this a very interesting article. It shows that there is dissension within the Ukrainian military about this operation. It shows that the recriminations are already flying and that the fingers are pointing and that various Ukrainian officers are busy pointing the finger at Zelensky himself and that he is now being blamed for this debacle, which is interesting and might point to further political turbulence in Kiev. But of course, and in the meantime, we have the actual situation in Kursk region. And this is what I'm now going to turn to, because over the last couple of hours, we have had lots of reports about military developments in Kursk region. Now, the fog continues to be very heavy, the fog of war. Group of Forces North continues to churn out its bulletins, but they're not really providing us with a huge amount of information about what is actually going on. They tell us that their advances have been substantial, that they advanced another 2 kilometers in the Kursk region, but they don't make it clear quite what that means or where that was. They continue to report very heavy losses by the Ukrainians. Group of Forces North estimates Ukrainian losses in the 24-hour period before their last dispatch at 410 dead and wounded in Sumy region and in Kursk region. They also say 2 Leopard tanks were destroyed during that time. Those would be now Leopard 1 tanks. So we don't know exactly what is going on, but it does seem as if the Russian breakthrough in the western section, the western flank of the Ukrainian enclave in Kursk region, has become very deep, that the Russians have established control of the entire west bank of the Snagust River. There's a hint in the latest, Group of Forces North bulletin that the Russians are on the brink of capturing Lyubimovka and that they're close to capturing Plekhovo itself, but the language is difficult, is evasive, and doesn't quite make it clear what exactly is going on in those two places. But anyway, there are reports that the Russians have now advanced into the central areas, into the central northern part, the north-central part of this enclave, and that there are large numbers of Ukrainian troops cut off at the very northern fringe of this enclave where they took positions. And the Russians have been providing lots of pictures of Ukrainian movements, troop movements, vehicle movements, trying to move southwards towards Sudzha along various roads in what looks like a panicky escape before they are cut off. And the Russians, according to the film that they've been providing of these convoys, have had no difficulty destroying these convoys. They've been picking them off one by one, and apparently the Ukrainian losses have been very high. Now, I use the word panic, and interestingly enough, Military Summary Channel used the same word, and then a few hours later we got that same word used by Group of Forces North itself. There is real chaos and panic in the enemy ranks in the Korenovo sector. Yesterday, some of the Ukrainian armed forces units experienced something similar to the events in Ilovaisk. Ilovaisk was a battle that took place in eastern Ukraine, Donbass, in 2014, when the Ukrainians suffered a major military defeat, which basically led to the collapse of their offensive to try to bring Donbass fully back under their control. And it was what eventually led first to Minsk I and to Minsk II. But anyway, the Ukrainians, yesterday, some of the Ukrainian armed forces units experienced something similar to the events in Ilovaisk, having lost supplies and found themselves surrounded. The fighters of Group of Forces North offered them the choice to surrender and stop senseless resistance. However, for some reason, the enemy began a panic flight from their positions, as a result of which we destroyed up to 50 enemy personnel, with seven being taken prisoner. Several examples of Western armoured vehicles were also captured as trophies, and the Russians have provided pictures of this. Well, that looks as if the northern part of Ukraine's Kursk enclave is collapsing, and is collapsing in a completely disorganized way. And if it is correct that the Russians have taken positions on the entirety of the West Bank of the Snagast River, and that they're close to capturing Plekhovo as well, as I discussed in my program yesterday, that opens up the further possibility that before long, the entire enclave could be cut off from resupply by Ukraine, and this in the weeks just before the autumn rains begin, making movement inside the enclave for the Ukrainians a nightmare. And incidentally, when I say that, I spoke the other day about how Russian drones are now operating continuously in the skies over the Ukrainian forces in Kursk and in Sumy region. And because the Ukrainians do not have air defense systems to speak of in the Kursk region, any that they deploy or try to deploy there are rapidly destroyed. It's interesting that they have now started to use, the Russians have started to use, for the first time on a systematic basis in this war, their drones, their large drones that are closer in concept to the Predator and the Reaper, the American Predator and Reaper drones like the Orion, which they have not really used in this conflict before. These, of course, are drones, small light aircraft type drones. They're fairly stealthy. They can conduct long patrols over the roads in Kursk region, constantly observing and tracking and monitoring the roads to see whether there's any Ukrainian movements. And if they do detect movements, they're now equipped with air-to-surface missiles and bombs, and they can attack immediately those convoys, those Ukrainian convoys, as they try to move along the roads. I don't know how many of these Orion drones the Russians are using. Anybody could guess, I can't. But anyway, they are being used, and of course, with their long loiter times, they have a capability which has not been used in the drone war by the Russians up to now. Anyway, so an unfolding disaster in the Kursk enclave with signs of disorganization and panic on the part of the Ukrainian forces. Ukraine's own offensive in this area, the offensive that the Ukrainians have tried to launch towards Glushkovo, seems to be going nowhere. the Ukrainians continue to suffer heavy losses. The Russians' group of forces north says this about it: fierce fighting continues in Glushkovo district of Kursk region. The enemy is bringing in reserves, deploying military intelligence units and Western armoured vehicles. Over the past 4 hours, we repelled 4 attacks on the settlement of Vesyoloye, destroying up to 40 personnel, a tank, an infantry fighting vehicle, and an armoured combat vehicle. And the Russians are claiming elsewhere that another convoy of Ukrainian vehicles operating in this area was caught in the open and was destroyed by mass drone attacks. Again, they produced some pictures. I can't really make much sense of the pictures myself, but that is what the Russians say. So, an unfolding debacle in the Kursk region, and we can see the first signs of recriminations starting to appear in Ukraine itself. Ukrainian military officers starting to distance themselves from the whole affair, criticizing Zelensky personally for launching an operation that made no military or strategic sense. Zaluzhny, perhaps, seeing his opportunity to get back at Zelensky, doing what he has repeatedly done throughout the entire conflict, which is leak information, presenting himself as the voice of sanity and reason, pushing back against Zelensky's crazy plans. I've no doubt that Zaluzhny is behind the story, by the way, to Politico, just saying. And anyway, we can see that the emerging debacle in Kursk looks like becoming a major factor in Ukraine's domestic politics. Well, that's the situation in Kursk region. Elsewhere, in every other part of the battlefields, the situation for the Ukrainians continues to get worse and worse. Now, yesterday, we received visual confirmation that the Russians are in total control of Ukrainsk. This has been reported by many sources, including by a Russian journalist who, according to Redovka, is actually there on the scene. And the Russians have published film showing Russian soldiers raising their flag, to be precise, the red Soviet victory banner. The Russian tricolors are also often used. Anyway, the Russians have released pictures showing Russian soldiers raising their flags in various places in Ukrainsk, including, by the way, the buildings of the coal mine west of Ukrainsk, and the slag heap. So it looks as if the Ukrainian troops, who we were being told were cut off in Ukrainsk, have either escaped. Well, in fact, almost certainly they have escaped, because I've heard no stories of any mass surrenders by the Ukrainians there. And we're getting more reports now that the Russians, having taken control of Ukrainsk, they've now turned their attention to the 2 other places that they want to capture in this area, which is Sukhorinie to the west, which is, of course, the village before the war. It numbered around 1,700 people. And Girnik, or Gornyak, the village, the small town immediately to the south of Ukrainsk, with a similar population to Ukrainsk, around 10,000 people. So the Russians are moving on, seeking to capture both of these places. And a couple of days ago, the Russian Defense Ministry said that they had captured the village of Zelanya Pershe, and it's likely that they will be pushing on to capture the next village of Zelanya Drucha. And the advance towards Girnik and Zelanie Drucha, of course, ultimately points to an operation, an operation towards Kurachovo, with Russian forces converging on Kurachovo from multiple directions, from Krasnogorovka, where they have reached the village of Gostye, west of Kurachovo, from Maximilianovka, another village close to Kurachovo, where the Russians have been fighting for several months, actually, from Vugleda, about which we've heard far less over the last couple of days. The last report is that the Russians are in secure control of coal mine South Donbass number 3, and that they're beginning their attack on Bogoyavlenka, and that they're still mopping up in South Donbass number 1, the coal mine closer to Vugleda, from which, as I said, the officer cadre who were in command there has apparently fled. Anyway, just saying. So the Russians coming very close, getting significantly closer now to that point where they can basically crush, destroy, dismember, or at any rate expel the entire Ukrainian force located in southern Donetsk region. There's some suggestions that the Ukrainians will now pull all their forces westwards from Kurachovo along the road to the south of the Kurachovo reservoir to the west. That's something I said they ought to do some time ago, and I think they need to start thinking about doing that pretty much without delay, actually. Anyway, there's some talk that they might do that. One way or the other, it looks to me that Kurachovo's days are numbered. If Girnik falls, then definitely Kurachovo's days are numbered. And in the meantime, the Russians continue to clear the fields west of the village of Nivolskoye and north of Krasnogorovka. The Russian forces are gradually advancing westwards across these fields. I've come to the conclusion, by the way, that there are no Ukrainian troops in these fields, that the Ukrainians did, in fact, withdraw their forces from this territory some days ago, perhaps even earlier, and that what is slowing the Russian advance through these fields is that the Ukrainians, probably before leaving, planted a large number of mines in these fields, which the Russians need to clear as they gradually move their forces to the west. Anyway, all of these Russian forces are going to converge. They're going to converge around the Kurachovo reservoir, which is a body of water, artificial body of water, and then Kurachovo itself will come under attack, as I said, from multiple directions, most probably after Vugleda is captured. And then, as I said, the whole Ukrainian position in southern Donbass will finally and conclusively collapse. And further north, we've had more reports, confirmation, as I said previously, that the Russians control the landfills, the slag heaps north of Novogorodivka. The Deep S mapping project, the Ukrainian mapping project, has now basically conceded what I am sure has been true for some time, that the Russians are in control of the entire village of Grodivka, north to Pokrovsk, and of course the Russians are busy bombing and shelling Pokrovsk. About Selidovo, we have heard less. I suspect that once the Russians capture the village of Tsukurinye, west of Ukrainsk, a Russian attack, storming operation to clear Selidovo will begin in earnest. And when all of these various towns and villages fall under Russian control, then the main attack on Pokrovsk itself will begin. And to repeat a point I've made many times, there is a fundamental difference between Pokrovsk and all of the other places that the Russians have had to storm before: Mariupol, Avdiivka, Bakhmut, Krasnogorovka, Toretsk. All of these places were part of a large body of fortified positions, heavy entrenched lines, each of which supported each other. Pokrovsk, if you look at a map, once all of these places have fallen, is isolated, the roads leading to it relatively simple to cut off. I don't think that the Ukrainians will be able to resist in Pokrovsk for anything like the same amount of time as some people assume. And, well, there's apparently been more information about Toretsk, that the Russians are now starting to storm, or at least have begun the first steps to storm, the high-rise building area at the center of Toretsk, the so-called Toretsk citadel. We'll see how much of a resistance the Ukrainians can put up there. In my opinion, if this area falls, Toretsk falls, and that could be just a few weeks away. It seems to me as if the communications, Ukrainian communications, supply links to Toretsk are now under considerable pressure. And I doubt that the Ukrainian grouping in Toretsk is going to be able to withstand the Russian advance in this area for very long. And in Chasiv Yar, less information recently, but it does seem as if the Russians continue to make progress there, both in the center of the city, of the town, and on its flanks. And the Russians are also busy enlarging the territory that they control along the Oskol and Zherebets rivers. And of course, they're now beyond the Zherebets river and preparing to attack Kupiansk. In fact, there isn't a single area of the front lines where the situation could be said to be stable or going well from a Ukrainian point of view. And the other day, there was a report that the Russians managed to shoot down 3 Ukrainian fighter jets, 2 Sukhoi 27s and 1 MiG-29, all in the space of a single day. So coming back to that report from Bloomberg, when they say that there is no sign of a breakthrough, there is ample evidence of a breakthrough. Only they don't want to admit as much. They don't want to face that all too obvious reality. Just saying. So, we engage in mind games, in dangerous escalatory moves, or we talk to each other about plans for off-ramps that can never achieve anything, even as Ukraine moves closer and closer to the point of its eventual collapse. If we see a debacle play out in Ukraine, obviously the Ukrainians must assume some responsibility, but the biggest fault will lie with our governments and leaders in the West. Now, this is where I finish my discussion of the situation in Ukraine. There is a lot of ominous and worrying talk about an Israeli offensive on Hezbollah in Lebanon. Over the last couple of hours, there has been a whole succession of killings of Hezbollah soldiers and a few civilians as well, as a result of exploding pages. It's widely assumed that these were rigged by Israeli intelligence. There's a lot of speculation and discussion as to how that was done. I'm not going to waste time on it. I don't think, for the record, that this is an especially complicated or difficult operation, but then what do I know about such things? Anyway, there's a lot of discussion about this. More concerning still, there are lots of reports that Prime Minister Netanyahu is about to sack Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, who apparently has been resisting Netanyahu's demands for an offensive against Hezbollah. And all of the indications are, as I've said many times, many programs, as we've discussed in the Duran, all the indications are that Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to widen the war that has been playing out in Gaza, and by the way, continues there, but he wants to widen it. He wants to take on Hezbollah. There's talk that he wants to do it before the autumn, when the weather conditions apparently become more difficult. And he's not going to let someone like Gallant or any concerns expressed in Washington stand in his way. Now, I'm not going to discuss this further in this program because this remains, for the moment, an unstable situation. Gallant, for example, as at the time of making this program, continues to be Israel's defense minister, and apparently he continues to oppose this operation and the Hezbollah operation, the offensive into Lebanon, and there are reports that he has the support in this of the United States. So it is not yet a done thing. But in my opinion, a wider war in the Middle East is coming. I've said this in several programs. So has Alistair Crook, the former British diplomat who is an expert in this region, which I, of course, am not. And I'm going to express my own opinion, which is that even as Ukraine goes down and the war in Ukraine ends next year, almost certainly in a Russian victory, so attention will be redirected towards the crisis in the Middle East, which could be even more dangerous than the one in Ukraine. Meanwhile, we also have reports that the head of Russia's Security Council, Sergei Shoigu, has rushed to Tehran, where he's having urgent consultations with the Iranian leaders. So, lots is going on in the Middle East. The situation there is very dangerous. The storm clouds are gathering. Prime Minister Netanyahu, as I said, clearly wants a war. That's been obvious to me for weeks now. He's been thwarted of the war he wants for some time. Sooner or later, in some way or other, he will get his war. And then we will see. Anyway, in the meantime, this is where I finish my program today. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Also, please remember that you can check out our shop and support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.